Hi everyone, this video today is about how to gather. I use gathering a lot in my patterns. I love a good gather. So that means if you're using any of my patterns, you'll really need to know how to gather. But luckily it is super duper easy. So the first step that you need to do is sew 2 rows of gathering stitching. Now you'll see I've sewn mine in black. That is just for illustrative purposes. You can totally sew it in the same thread that you would use for the rest of the garment. You'll need to set your stitch length on your sewing machine to the longest length. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how to do that because each sewing machine settings are a little bit different. But if you Google it, I'm sure Google will have all of the answers. So as you can see, you sew 2 rows of gathered stitching. This row here, the top row, is 0.5 centimeters from this edge, and then this row, the bottom row, is 1.5 centimeters from that same edge. Now the reason for that is because we are using a 1 centimeter seam allowance when we attach this pattern piece to the garment. Which means that you will sew in between these 2 rows of gathered stitching when you stitch this pattern piece to the garment. Now some people will use like a single stitch method and just sew 1 row of gathering stitching along here, along their seam allowance. Some people will use a zigzag stitch as well. Those techniques are totally fine. But I just prefer this 2-row method just because I know it's a little bit more work at the outset, but when you come to attach this pattern piece to your garment, it will be a lot easier. So this is the way I recommend doing it. The other thing I would say is, as you can see, this is quite a long pattern piece. This is the peplum for the Georgina top. I would say if you're using a long pattern piece like this, so a peplum or maybe doing a skirt pattern piece, I wouldn't sew right the way around in one go. I always split it into 2. So here you'll see I've started sewing at this seam here, and I've sewed my gathering stitching right the way along and finished it at this seam here, and then again I've started my gathering stitching at this seam and sewed it right the way along to this underseam. If the pattern piece is really long, you might find it quite tricky to gather it right the way along that seam. And you might find that the threads break a little bit easier. So I definitely recommend doing it in 2 pieces if your pattern piece is really long. Okay, so once you have sewn that gathering stitching, what you need to do is knot the threads at one end. So if we pick up this end here, now what you can do is you can just take these threads here and tie them at the top. Just tie them there. That's totally fine. But what I prefer to do is actually take this thread here and pull on it, and you'll see that there's a little loop here where the thread from the underside has come through. And the same with this one. You pull on it and you'll see there's that little loop there where the thread has come through. So what I do is I just use a pin and I pull on that loop so those threads come through. And then from there, I tie the threads together like that. Now again, this is totally optional, totally up to you, but I just find it makes it a little bit neater and there's no sort of puckering at the end when you start to pull on the threads. And I always do a triple knot just to triply ensure that it doesn't come off the end. So yeah, what that knot does is just ensures that when you're sewing this pattern piece, that the gathering doesn't just slip right off the end, which can happen. Okay, so once you have knotted the threads there, you go to the other end of the stitching and you do the same. So you'll pull these two upper threads, pull on those loops and bring the thread from beneath round to the upside of the fabric. And then we actually do our gathering. So to do that, take these two top rows, threads, pull these away, so pull the bottom ones away so you don't pull on them. Grab a hold of these two top rows and start to pull. And as you start to pull, you'll notice that the fabric here will start to gather. Now you'll just pull until it becomes tight here, and then just use your thumb and your forefinger to push that gather along that gathered stitching, just like that. So you pull on these two threads here, pull, pull, pull until it gets tight, and then use your thumb and forefinger to drag that gathering down the seam. Okay, so I won't do the whole peplum pattern piece because that will take me a little while, but I think that gives you a good idea of what to do. So you just pull on those two top threads until it becomes tight, and then use your thumb and forefinger to push the gathering right the way along. So eventually you'll push it right the way along until it comes right to here, and that entire pattern piece will be gathered. At that point you will knot these ends as well, again just to stop them coming off, stop the gathering from coming off, sliding off when you're sewing. So just do a couple knots here, and the same with this one, couple knots here, just like that. And then you'll come and do the same with these other two rows of gathered stitching. So pull the threads through, knot them at this end, and then come to this end, pull the threads through and pull on those top threads and push the gathering along that edge until you have that edge entirely gathered. Okay, so then at that point you'll see it will look something like this little piece here. And as I said before, when you attach this pattern piece to the garment, you'll sew it with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which means that you'll sew it between those two rows of gathered stitching there. And what that does is make sure that it's really easy to sew it on to start with, and also the gathering will be nice and even. Okay, I think that's all I have to say about gathering. I really hope that helps. And as usual, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.